inshallah. To speak a little bit more about the history of this masjid and this area, we have two short speakers. We have firstly a young budding historian that I'd like to introduce to you. We know the great historian of the past, Dr. Ahmad David al-Marhoom, may Allah have mercy on him and grant him a Jannah, inshallah. This young scholar, a very young man, I think, in my humble estimation, is going to make that kind of contribution. His name is Abdud-Daiyaan Petersen. Abdud-Daiyaan is a student at the University of Cape Town, an honor student, previously based at the Environmental and Geographical Sciences in the Department of UCT. And he has a long CV, but I'm not going to tell you anything about that CV. The most important part of Abdud-Dayyaan's CV, which he didn't give to me, that he is a grandson of another great elder in our community, but not from Claremont, Imam Amin Basadi al-Marhoom, rahimahullah, from the Nurul Islam Masjid. And it is very coincidental that we invited Abdud-Daiyaan. I invited him because he is a historian. But when this masjid was established by Salamuddin Daris, he made the Imam of the Nurul Islam Masjid in Baitengracht Street, who was the great Imam Abdul Rauf, who was the youngest son of Tuan Guru. He made the Imam of that masjid the trustee of the Claremont Main Road Mosque. Imam Abdul Rauf then left the Nurul Islam Masjid, came to the Claremont Main Road Mosque, and of course we know generations of his sons and their sons of the Abdul Rauf then were imams. And then when there was a court case, they looked at the title deed, and it said that the Imam of the Baitengracht Street Masjid should be the trustee of the Claremont Main Road Masjid. And the judge asked, who is this Imam? And of course it was Imam Amin Basadi al-Marhoom. And the Imam was shocked. He said, but I don't want to be the trustee. And that is how they established a board of governors through a judgment of the Cape Town High Court at the time in 1978. So I would like to invite Abdud-Daiyaan to speak to us a little bit about the history of this particular area, Claremont and Newlands. Shukran.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everybody. I just want to add on to Imam Rashid's introduction about my great-grandfather, Imam Amin Ria. He was actually born in Claremont in the 1890s, and he grew up in Claremont itself. And so it was coincidental that when he was made Imam as a Khatib previously of the old Imam Ismail Khanif Edwards, when he became Imam and he found out he was trustee, it was even more of a shock because he grew up in this community and he was born in this community. But enough about my family and Amin. I was asked to give a very brief 15 minutes, I might have to cut it even shorter now, on the history of Newlands and Claremont, and particularly in terms of the Muslim history of the area. And I had cut it into 3 different segments of Muslim history in this area. The first is the segment of introduction. How was Islam first introduced into the area? The second is the clandestine. How was Islam practiced secretly in the area because of the situation? And then thirdly, formalization. How was Islam formalized in this area to create this community, of the Claremont Muslim community? So the foundation of this area, the broader Claremont Newlands area, goes back to the pre-colonial period during the time of the Khoi. Before Jan van Riebeeck came in 1652, this entire area, the entirety of the Cape Flats was inhabited by the local indigenous Khoi, and their cattle trails actually ran along what is now Main Road, so literally along this road over here. And one of the main kraale of the Khoi at the time when the Dutch came here, they called it the Ronde Doornbos, which is the round thorn bush. And that is where the name Rondebosch came from, because the Khoi were based there at the time. And so, because the Liesbeek River also flowed, in this area, it was a very fertile land. And the Dutch realized that it would be one of the best places to actually start, a number of plantations, farms, and so on. And so this is when we see, many of these different farms going up. So Protea, which is now Bishop's Court, the vineyard. There was another one up further into the mountain called Paradise Park. There were, many all along Grooteskuur as well. And then one of the most important in this side was the Newlands at Nieuweland or Papenboom at the time. And when they came there, to set up these farms, it was also, at a distance enough from the city that they placed many of the political exiles from Indonesia on these farms. Because placing them this far means they didn't have influence on the slaves that were living in Buka, in the city, in town at the time. And so the first introduction of Islam to this part of Cape Town, of the peninsula, was the placement of these Muslims on many of these farms. And one of the earliest of these exiles that I could find was a massive lot, 30 Makassarese exiles from Makassar were placed in 1680 on Rustenburg farm. And it seems, quite disconnected at the time, but it's important to note that, the main road, ensured that many of these different farms flowed into each other, and, there was a lot of movement even that far back. And, in the 1600s and early 1700s, we see many more of these political exiles coming. One of the most prominent was the Raja of Tambora, Abdul-Basil, who was actually the son-in-law, although disputed, but the son-in-law of Sheikh Yusuf of Makassar. So we can see that connection over there in around 1697. And there's records that state that that very same Raja of Tambora was one of the first people to actually transcribe the Quran from memory in South Africa in the 1690s. And one of the later exiles that came, that was also put on Newlands and spread amongst here, were a lot of around 24 mixed Chinese and Malay exiles called Peranakan, and the chief of them was an individual by the name of Dipanagara, and he was the son of one of the sultans on Java. And they were quite prominent Muslims at the time, and this was in 1724. So we can see, in that period of the late 1600s into the 1700s, the introduction of Islam through many of these, many of them were actually well-learned Islamic scholars as well. And that then brings us into the second period, which is the clandestine. Now, under Dutch rule, the Dutch East India Company, there was a placard or a law that stated that no religion may be tolerated in their colonies other than the Dutch Reformed Church. And so naturally, they were not allowed to practice Islam at the Cape. And so what happened was many of these Muslims, they went underground, they went, into their lodges and into the quiet places, into the fields. And it's in these fields that they would perform the khadats and they would perform the dhikrs and the mawlud. And so this mawlud, part of the mawlud section that we did today, I'm sure most of the Jama'ah know that it's from the Mawlud Sharaful Anam. I'm not sure how many are aware of that. And this specific Sharaful Anam, not the riwayats, the Sharaful Anam was introduced to the Cape specifically in the Lagos from those very people that were brought from Southeast Asia. And so they would be practicing these mawlud, in the fields, in the little pandokis and so on, that they would do secretly in the countryside at the time. And this period of the clandestine continued up until the early 1800s, where in reality there's almost no record of Muslims living in this part of the city. The only record that we have of Muslims is mostly in Buka and in town itself. And after that period of the clandestine, we see that that law of only Islam being practiced was lifted in the early 1800s. Those placarten, the statutes of India were lifted, and Islam was allowed to be practiced. And this also coincided with the British taking over from the Dutch in 1806. And it's from this date that we see a lot more literature about Muslims, particularly in this area. We also see Muslim names popping up amongst the enslaved. So at that time, most of the people, if not all of the people that had worked on these farms here in this part of the peninsula were enslaved people. And I know we believe in our community that most of us come from Southeast Asia, Malaysia, or Indonesia and so on. But the reality, and according to the documents themselves, is that most of the slaves actually came from Madagascar and Mozambique, particularly in this area. And it's because of their origins that we had this very derogatory term in our community for darker Muslims or darker colored people, which is Maspika, which comes from the fact that many of those people came from that part of Africa and were brought here to work on the farms. And so we see the coinciding of these, some of them Muslim, some non-Muslim, of African slaves, Southeast Asian slaves in a minority, as well as a number of Indian slaves as well, with many of these political exiles as well. And around this period, building on the work of, I'm not sure how many people know about Mr. Ibrahim Roda, he wrote about Strand, but he formulated that Twanguru in Buka actually sent out deputies as da'is to give da'wah, further into the peninsula and into the colony at the time. And so in Strand there was Imam Abdul Samad, in what was Deep River there was Ahmad van Makassar, the forefather of Imam Yasin Harris. Even in Simonstown people were sent out. But we don't have any written records of who was sent to this area of Claremont and Newlands. And the only evidence that we know that people were here is through the names of Muslims popping up in that period. And so when we look at some of the census records, we see some very familiar names popping up. We see a name like Slamdin popping up, was the individual that endowed this masjid. We see a name Asya popping up. I'm not sure if the descendants know, but Asya was the father of another individual named Kamaldin. He's the forefather of the Kamaldin family. Another individual named Ontom, the father of someone named Tofi, the forefather of the Tofi family. And we can see in the 1820s, many of these different people, popping up as freed slaves among that community. And slowly you start to have, a taste of a community being born. And, we don't have any evidence of a maqbara or a masjid at the time. However, we know the practice of the Muslims at the time was to establish something called a langar. I know many of the older Buttas and Tikis over here will remember what the langar is. It's like a little salah khana before an actual masjid was established. And so, I am very sure that there was actually a langar that was established in this area. And around 20 years later, in the 1840s, by the time when all of the enslaved people were free, we start to see that those very same slaves built themselves up to earn some money, whether it's through perekar or it was through masonry, or they were painters, they were sculptors, they were wood carvers, through their trades, they built themselves up to make some money. And you see that many of these people start to either purchase land or granted land in exchange for some of their trades. And this is particularly when we see a very prominent individual in the records known as Ago van der Kaap or Ajo van der Kaap starting to pop up. And he's granted quite a large proportion of land in the Sanssouci area, which is the school is still there, but this larger area or farm was known as Sanssouci. And this Ajo van der Kaap, later on we find out that his actual name was Ajuhar, and he's the forefather of the Ajuhar family. And from a very old Mesang tombstone that we found in the Kubus over there, there was one that described him as Sheikh Ajuhar. So we don't know much about the leadership and the formation of the Muslim community in that period, but here we see some evidence that Ajuhar himself, Ajo van der Kaap, was actually the leader, the imam, the sheikh of this very early budding community of freed slaves that rose out of this area. And around that same period, Slamdin's brother Samai, a very prominent carriage man, he was the horse and cart driver for the famous astronomer Herschel. He was granted property, as well as their third brother Kamis also became quite prominent, and he settled up in Makassar itself, you know, the famous Daris and Kamis family over there. And so it was these three brothers, Asya that I mentioned. There was also an individual named Badruddin, someone named Fakhruddin, and some of the early Muslims that started to take transfer of property in the area. And it's from that time that we also see the establishment of two main features, you know, that highlight community in the area, or established community, and that is a masjid and a maqbara. And so in terms of the masjid, the very first masjid that went up in this area was this masjid. In 1849, Slumdin himself had purchased this property. By 1850, it was already being built. 1851, the masjid was built. And only in 1854, 170 years ago, was that trust document drawn up where Imam Rashid referenced that. Imam Abdul-Rauf of Baitin Street Masjid was made the trustee of the masjid. But even before that, in the around 1850, you know, the space was already being used as a masjid at that time. At the same time, the same Slumdin also owned property on that side of what is now the railway, and he endowed what was a maqbara. And so one of the earliest maqbaras is the old Draper Street maqbara, and I'm not sure how many old Claremont residents can remember that there used to be a kubus on that ground over there, which is where many of the older families, the Slumdins, even some of the Abdurraufs and older families were buried, as well as across next to the Claremont Road Masjid, which is still being used today. And those are just two kubuses or maqbaras in the area. There were another three in the surrounding area. I'm not sure how many are aware that even on Rondebosch Common, there was a maqbara that was endowed at the same time in 1854. There was a maqbara in Newlands, just off Newlands Avenue, and there were quite a number in this area, which highlight the prominence, specifically of Muslims that they had in the area, and the effect that they had, in this area as a community. And we even see from, municipal documents that, the municipality themselves admitted that it was the Muslim community, as they termed the Malays, that ensured that, Newlands, Claremont, even Wynberg was turned into such a cosmopolitan and mercantile area, a lot of different shops, because of this very Muslim community at the time. And from that Ajuhad that I mentioned, one of his daughters married the son of another freed slave from Buka by the name of Harun Barkhia, and that is actually the ancestor, the forefather of Imam Harun himself. So I found it quite fitting that Imam Harun, is the descendant, direct descendant of one of the very first Imams of this masjid. And I think after the masjid, was established and the maqbaras were established, most of the history had been written up, recorded in the book, the history of Claremont. And I think from then on, most of us are familiar with how the history progressed over time. Shukran.
Shukran, Daiyaan. I'm sure Daiyaan has given you a little taste of his talent. When the Maqbara at Claremont Road, we reopened it. I must not say this, but Daiyaan went there and saved some of the tombstones as Onasekwe. And he deciphers the names of people. This is the kind of passion that he has, and we wish, inshallah, we pray in good health, and many more of our young people to come up, because this history has not even been written. It's a lot that needs to be done in terms of archiving, in terms of discovering